Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this wonderful world of ours. I hope that you and yours are safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, we're going to try to unpack Iran and specifically U.S. policy for Iran. And to help us do this, analyze this complex and critical problem, I'm pleased to welcome to Carnegie Connects two of the country's finest analysts of Iran and the U.S.-Iranian relationship. They don't need introductions, but if I can find them, I will give them a brief nod. It would take most of the program to do justice to their resumes. Robin Wright is a contributing writer and columnist, has written for The New Yorker since 1988. Her first piece on Iran won the National Magazine Award for Best Reporting. A former correspondent for The Post, CBS News, LA Times, Sunday Times of London. She's reported from more than 140 countries. That number may actually have gone up one or two, perhaps. She's also a distinguished fellow where I used to work at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and has been a fellow at Brookings and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as Yale, Duke, Dartmouth, and the University of California at Santa Barbara. Suzanne Maloney is the Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where her research focuses on Iran and Persian Gulf energy. Prior to being named Vice President and Director, she served as the Deputy Director of Foreign Policy Program for 5 years. At Brookings, she's a leading voice on U.S. policy toward Iran and the broader Middle East, testifying before Congress, briefing policymakers, engaging with government officials, nonprofits, and corporations. She's a frequent commentator, as is Robin, on national and international media. Let me make a comment or two before we get to the discussion, and we're going to come back to this notion. My own view of this is there are really no good deals with Iran. You're dealing with an authoritarian, repressive regime that imprisons and kills its own citizens, interferes in the internal politics of at least 4 Arab capitals, governments, fuels Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine, and then there's the nuclear issue. Iran is probably, classically, perhaps defined now as a nuclear weapons threshold state. In essence, it may not have made a decision to weaponize, but it has the knowledge and the resources to do so, should it wish to do so. In essence, we confront the U.S. administration after administration, confronts a strategic problem, but we lack a strategic solution. That is to say, all of Washington's efforts, I'm not being critical here, just reporting, all of its policy options going forward over the last 15 years are by necessity transactional, not transformational. They're interim, not final. They're compartmentalized, not comprehensive. And everyone is severely constrained by our own domestic politics and Iran's internal politics. So before we get to what the U.S. should do, how it should approach this conundrum, I want to try to get both of our guests to assess where we are in terms of Iran internal politics a year after Mahsa Amini's murder. 20,000 arrested, correct me on the numbers, both of you, 500 plus killed. How would each of you evaluate, number one, the resilience of the women's life freedom movement, and second, the regime's response? Robin, could we begin with you on Iran internal?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Aaron, for hosting us. And Suzanne, I'm your biggest fan, so I'm delighted to share the stage as it is. This is an interesting moment. In the last year, we've seen that for the first time in human history, women be the and provide the leadership for a counter revolution or a revolution against an Islamic regime. It's been inspirational. It has been persistent. It's been brave. It reflects the kind of generational change three generations after the revolution. The fact that the majority of women are educated, something well over 90%, and over 60% of the students in universities are female. They are part of society in a way they weren't necessarily under the monarchy. But the reality is that we're talking about a group that was initially largely teenagers and young women in their early 20s taking to the streets. They had an idea, they knew what they were against, but they didn't have a common agenda or an organization, a leadership, joint resources. So they knew what they were against, they knew how to stand up imaginatively and protest, but they didn't have the mechanisms or the means or the kind of alternative to oust the regime and create an alternative. What's been interesting is that over the last 6 years, since 2017, there has been a steady increase, acceleration of the number of protests that always start over one issue, often economic, the price of eggs and poultry, gas price hike, but then grow to be about the regime itself, and including criticism and calls for the oust of the dictator, or as they call it, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So we've seen something that is part of a broader movement that reflects the disillusionment, domestic fury, discontent 44 years after the revolution. It's very meaningful, but I never thought that they could alone bring about the end of the regime, but they are yet another piece that is increasingly challenging a stubborn, authoritarian, rigid, brutal, repressive regime.
Yeah. So it's resilient and it will be sustained. The question is at what level and what will it be? What will the impact be in terms of achieving their goals, and how precisely can they do that? Suzanne, let me turn to you. Your takeaways from watching the last year of protests and where we may be going?
Thanks so much, Aaron, for having me on, and especially thanks for having me on with Robin, who is just the best of the best on this and so many other issues. So I'm just really glad to be part of the conversation. I agree with everything that Robin has had to say about the women life freedom movement, but I do have a sense that this is somehow different. As she said, there have been recurrent episodes of unrest in Iran, really dating back to the revolution itself. The first big protest that happened after the 1979 revolution was in fact mobilized by women on International Women's Day, who came out to protest rumors that the new government would in fact impose mandatory hijab. It wasn't yet the case, but it of course then came to pass. And so we see that, essentially throughout the history of the Islamic Republic, women have been at the forefront of social change and pressing for greater freedom for the entire population. And I think that what we've seen over the course of the past year, built upon those previous periods of unrest, the Green Movement in 2009, which was primarily about the election itself of a then very abhorrent figure to Iran's presidency, which was perceived as a rigged election. Then, as Robin said, a series of primarily economically driven protests that were quite violent and quite nihilistic in terms of their opposition to the regime itself, not just an issue, not just an election, but in fact, essentially calling to burn the whole place down. And in fact, they did that in many cases. And none of these protests have ever been satisfied. There has been, repression that has forced people back off the streets, that has quieted the tempo of the protests. But in fact, what we've been able to see is that the regime is never really able to fully satisfy the dissatisfaction of the growing proportion of the population. And I think what is notable about what's happened over the course of this past year is that, there is no, sort of path for moderation that's left within Iran. There is no expectation or hope that, in fact, there's somebody who could move the regime into a different place, either domestically or in terms of its relationship with the world, that could, in fact, give Iranians what they're looking for, which fundamentally is just security in their own homes and opportunity for themselves and their families. And so, I think we are not seeing the end of the regime. As Robin said, this was not a movement that was capable of in fact ending the regime just through a mass protest on the street. But I think that we are seeing the beginning of the end of the regime, and it's probably going to be a very long and messy unraveling.
Yeah, time obviously is the ultimate arbiter here. I mean, for a very long time, I measured my life in terms of administration time, 4 to 8 year increments. But we're not really talking about that here, are we? I mean, some argue, analysts have argued, that the end could come quickly. There could be a brittle break, and we should prepare ourselves for the possibility of that. But I want to get to the issue of the regime itself. Our colleague Robin at the Wilson Center, Halis Fandiari, we know and love, wrote recently that the regime fears, there is this fear that it will be unable to contain or control a revival of the protest movement that was ignited last September. Is the regime weaker or stronger as a consequence of what we've watched over the course of the last year? Robin?
I'd frame it a different way. I'd say it's more brittle. And revolutions are like onions. You peel away layers till you get down to the kind of the core. And Crane Britton's great book on the anatomy of a revolution talks about the 4 different stages. And the last one, if a revolution is to survive, or its ideology, is the transition to normalcy or becoming a state. And the challenge for utopian ideologies or authoritarian regimes is, can you provide enough for the people so that they buy into the social contract? Autocrats survive if they have 30% of the population to, man security, run the bureaucracy, and pay taxes, or run the economy. And Iran probably still has that 30%. In different ways, but the numbers against it are growing. The question, of course, is what's that flashpoint? Is it someone like in Tunisia, someone so dissatisfied he sets himself on fire and captures the imagination of a whole region? Or is it a big moment like the death of Ayatollah Khamenei, who now at 86, there are actuarial charts, and he's not going to live forever. I'll just say I have one anecdote. I was in Iran once when during the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the revolutionary leader, and my government liaison took me to lunch, and he was griping about the regime and so forth. And then there was a rumor on BBC that Khomeini had died, and he flipped immediately. And that deep Persian nationalism, this was someone who had protected the system, even though he didn't like the regime itself, even though he worked for it, but it was a job. So we have to be careful about what what flashpoints we think might be that pivot. Sometimes it takes someone like Gorbachev, or in South Africa, F.W. de Klerk, who they understand the reality of communism is not viable in a globalizing world, or apartheid is no longer affordable, to have 3 different systems for 3 different races in everything, from cemeteries, to hospitals where people are born. So I'm not sure what that flashpoint is. I agree with Suzanne completely. We are closer, but this is a regime, remember, that has a lot of resources and is increasingly turning to other allies in Russia and China. It's no longer turning to the West, which it lusted for. It wanted to be recognized by the United States and the Europeans. It is a predominantly Western-oriented society, but after 40 years and the way it's been treated, dumping of the nuclear deal and so forth, sanctions, it thinks the West is no longer the way to go.
Suzanne, so I take Robin's point, more fragile, more brittle, and if so, what's the evidence that in fact the regime is weaker? Are there discernible cracks, opposition that Iran? It's like reading coffee grinds and tea leaves. It's its own version of Kremlinology, I suppose. There's got to be a name for it pertaining to Iran, but weaker, more brittle.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, and I would. I'm less interested, frankly, in the Kremlinology and in the sort of backbiting and infighting among the various factions of the regime. In part because those factions have become narrow, and in part because the kind of internal politicking of the regime itself, I think, is less relevant to Iran's future at this point than perhaps at any time in its history. It's very clear that all the levers of power are consolidated in the hands of what is the hardest of the hardliner group within the regime, and so that the former Iranian foreign minister Javad Zarif is effectively irrelevant today. Former Iranian presidents and prime ministers, one of whom has been now a dozen years under house arrest. They're not able to really manifestly impact either the policies or the views of the people on the street. But I think what is important is not this sort of criticism and infighting within the factions themselves, but I would say just 2 points. One is that the regime was, it quieted the protests, but it never satisfied them. It never found a way to kind of end this period of dissatisfaction except through force on the streets. And, there hasn't been any real, sort of turnabout in terms of the regime's appeal to its own population. And even more importantly, what we now apparently see is, the regime was never able to fully reimpose the hijab mandate. And so there are women on a day-to-day basis who go about their lives in public, unveiled, and risk the consequences. And this essentially creates a very big dilemma for the regime itself. Either they're going to have to, sort of individual by individual reimpose this mandate, or they're going to have to essentially let what has been one of the cornerstones of the ideology of the Islamic Republic begin to abate, at least to some extent. Now, we know, of course, they've passed a new law. They're going to try another big push the morality police back onto the streets in a really forceful way. But I think what is really interesting to me is that Iran has moved from, sort of outburst and eruption of unrest to what is essentially a civil disobedience movement. And it's a civil disobedience movement that invokes half the population. And that has a sympathy, we know from what happened over the course of the past year, of the other half of the population, because, the hijab is not just about, the sort of, physical appearance. It is about control of women, and it's about the safety and security of women. It's about the fact that every individual in Iran understood that either they themselves or their mother, sister, cousin, friend, when they walked the streets, was never fully safe from the long arm of Iranian hardliners, either in the security forces or out of the security forces, who might decide to do exactly what they did to Mahsa Amini, accuse them of a crime simply because a hair slipped out of a hijab, or they were wearing too much makeup, or they didn't have the sort of modest clothing on, whatever it might be. And that sense of insecurity is one that is so corrosive to society and, frankly, I think to the regime's power. And so I think, in effect, this is the issue. This is going to be a long-term challenge for the Islamic Republic.
Right. So we could witness rather than a dramatic crushing of the movement or the collapse of the regime, we could be in a period in which the repressive powers of the state will be maintained. The regime will remain intact, and yet you'll have a civil disobedience campaign, violent on the part of the regime, to be sure, that could simply continue month after month, while the economic, the social structures of Iranian society are under great stress. And this could continue. This could be the new, I hate to use the phrase, the new normal. Is that what both of you suggest we might be in store for? Robin?
So I think the most helpful thing I can say, and I say it over and over whenever I have an opportunity, is that Iran has always had to make a choice. And the bitterness and the internal discussion and debate, which is vibrant and deep across Iran among all factions, all sectors of society, is the Islamic Republic of Iran, its legal title, first and foremost an Islamic state in which God's law prevails and government is determined ultimately by a group of clerics? Or is it a republic in which man's law enacted by elected officials have the last word in running the government? And the debate has played out since the moment of the revolution. It played out in the writing of the Constitution, where they're based on French and Belgian law with an Islamic, parallel system imposed on top. And that's the key question. And it comes at a time that any revolution or any ideology, any utopian system, any autocratic system, it takes a confluence of factors to undermine it or begin to unravel it. And I think you've begun to see all of those, not in large enough numbers, but Iran has lost an estimated $450 billion over the last decade in oil revenues because of sanctions. And that's according to Iranian media reports. It's not, outside estimates. You find that growing numbers don't buy into the social contract. You find that for the first time in the 2021 presidential election, the majority of Iranians don't vote. And while we have an election next year, so does Iran for parliament on March 1st. And it'll be very interesting to see what numbers turn out. And this, whether they jack up the numbers or whatever, but last time we know that the majority opted not to vote. And then there are security issues, and this is where what kind of tensions. Now, Iran has gamed this recently very well by building this military alliance with Russia, even though it's for show. It's not for show. It's not as deep as either side would like to portray it. It's it's joining the BRICS, which is a big deal. Iran wants that recognition that it's not a pariah state. So there are not enough of those factors coming together yet, but there are a lot of them. And the question is, who's going to answer that ultimate question? Is it a republic or is it an Islamic state?
Yeah. I want to shift now to many questions, pieces of U.S. policy toward Iran, but I want to begin with one broad question. If you were looking at American efforts to respond to this extraordinary manifestation of courage and heroism on the streets by Iranian women and the Iranian public, how would you evaluate the U.S. response to this quest for internal change? Is it too much? Is it not enough? Is it the Goldilocks paradigm of just right? Should we be doing more? If in fact we should be doing more, what kinds of things would be effective? Suzanne, let me start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are no easy answers. We have relatively limited impact on the ground in Iran. We have 44 years of absence, and we don't have direct levers. Ultimately, it's the Iranian people who are going to make any change to their own government. That's always been the case. But I think that the Biden administration sought a kind of middle ground, and I don't think it worked effectively. They brought in activists and diaspora figures who were, sort of profoundly publicly sympathetic to the movement in Iran. They undertook a few symbolic sanctions. They helped, I think, with the effort to remove Iran from the UN's Commission on the Status of Women. That, I think, accomplished relatively little in terms of actually helping to blunt the regime's repression, or in fact to change the U.S. policy toward Iran. It was a lot of nice optics, but it wasn't supplemented by, I think, what we saw in a prior case of Iranian mistreatment of its own population. Think back to 2009. When 1 million Iranians came to the street to protest the rigged re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And that was also at a time where there was a democratic administration that was trying to revive nuclear diplomacy with Iran. When it became clear that neither the diplomacy would work, nor that the regime was going to fall, the Obama administration rallied the world and frankly used the fact that there was such outrage that people were watching the repression play out on their TV screens and in their newspapers every day, to help bring about the widest coalition around the most severe economic sanctions in that point in history of any country. And it had a dramatic impact. It brought Iran to the negotiating table over the next few years as a multilateral coalition of countries applied those sanctions. Now, obviously, Obama was primarily interested in the nuclear program. I don't want to overstate the extent to which his goal was regime change. It was not.
Right.
And of course, he was famously silent during the protests themselves, in part because of the fear of tainting those protesters in 2009. But he used the opportunity that was created by domestic dissent to put much greater pressure on Iran. And I think the Biden administration had that opportunity over the course of the past year, not just because of what was happening on the streets, but because of what Robin also alluded to, this burgeoning defense cooperation between Tehran and Moscow that has had a direct and positive impact on Russia's ability to hit Ukrainian critical infrastructure and Ukrainian civilians. The fact that the Biden administration hasn't sought to rally the world as it did over 2010 and 2011 effectively at a time when there is such tremendous outrage about what's happened on the streets of Iran, as well as what's happening in the skies over Ukraine. I think it was a huge missed opportunity.
And the opportunity is gone. It's missed now. It can't be somehow resurrected. And if it can't be resurrected, what is the constraint? I mean, you seem to be arguing for a much tougher policy on the part of the Biden administration to support internal dissent and protests within the administration.
Well, to deal with the array of problematic Iranian policies, and I think once again, as in 2009, we have a confluence. We have a country that is, as you said, essentially a nuclear threshold state as a result of throwing off the shackles of the JCPOA and pushing forward on its nuclear program that is involved in regional aggression. I think something like 82 attacks, missile and drone attacks in the region against U.S. positions in the region, is also involved in terrorism and military aggression outside its own neighborhood, especially with respect to Ukraine, and has a population that is clearly dissatisfied and is being repressed by its own government. So, what to me, pressure is the answer in a set of circumstances like that. And unfortunately, I think what we've seen from the Biden administration is a desire to push Iran to the back burner, to try to find a way to keep Iran from creeping back up into the top 5 issues that the president has to worry about on a daily basis, especially during a campaign year.
Right. It's de-escalation, I suspect. We're going to, for a specific reason, I think. But Robin, to you, not enough, too much, just right, should be tougher?
I'm not a policymaker and I never have been. But I think that we've seen 2 broad baskets of, as Suzanne outlined, those who believe you want to take the nuclear issue, get that off the table, and then try to sort out whether it's support for militant and extremist groups, human rights abuses, that whole other basket of issues. It's kind of a one at a time. Or do you try to, as the Obama administration did on the nuclear issue first, or as Trump did, maximum pressure, let's try to negotiate all. Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State, had his 12 demands, which, were unattainable in one go. So Iran has been a conundrum for 8 presidents since the 1979 revolution. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's a conundrum for the next 8 presidents. It's just a hard nut to crack because it has strategic importance. Where the geography of where it is, the neighborhoods that it overlaps with, the resources it has, and I'm a little less optimistic that pressure through sanctions will work. I mean, the 2 primary tools of any American administration is, use your military muscle or your economic power. And in this case, we are alone in our sanctions, and without the United Nations, without the rest of the world. And so there are other outlets. Iran is now selling as much oil, on average 2 million barrels a day, as it did during the bump after the nuclear deal was signed. Complicated at discounted costs and so forth, but it has a way to survive.
Yeah.
Not well, but so again, this is where we all understand the regime is in dire trouble, more trouble than it's ever been in, but it has tools as well for the short term to survive.
Right. So let's turn now, because there's a nice confluence here, to the much maligned, much criticized according to some people, Satan's finger on earth hostage prisoner release agreement between Iran and the United States. I'll ask you directly, both of you, on this question, because it does relate to the issue of de-escalation. It's not just about the redemption of American citizens, which I would argue my bias is showing. It's not just a personal interest; it's a national interest of the United States. Okay, Robin, you've written that the Iranians, according to Belgian sources, there are maybe 22 European hostages or assorted nationalities. So then let me ask you: Was this a good deal, a bad deal, or what did it seek to achieve?
Very simply, to the release of Americans and a step toward de-escalation. I think one of the things we haven't mentioned so far is that there has been a kind of parallel de-escalation in the number of attacks by Iranian proxies in both Syria and Iraq. There haven't been any attacks over the past year in Iraq, according to a general I spoke to yesterday, and not for 6 months in Syria. And Iran has made noises about it, going to limit it enrichment of uranium to 60%, far higher than 3.67% in the nuclear deal, but it's not 90%, which is what it takes to fuel a nuclear bomb. So, the atmospherics are important. So, and they have to have the right atmosphere to get to the point that countries are willing to make these kinds of deals. My problem, having covered the hostage takings in Iran at the embassy, I stood at the foot of the plane in Algiers when 52 Americans flew to freedom, and having many of my friends when I was based in Beirut taken hostage by Iran's proxy, Hezbollah. And the problem is they take 3 or 6 or 9 or 52, and then there's lots of drama, national trauma. The Americans are finally released, and oh my God, a few months later or a few years later, more Americans are picked up. This is a tactic that Iran has repeatedly used, and I deeply fear that this is not a tactic that it is about to abandon.
Yeah, this is not the first time, and it won't be the last. Suzanne, to you on this arrangement.
I'm going to be straightforward with you, Aaron, and I think this is probably true for Robin as well. But one of those, the longest held American in Iranian prison, Siamak Namazi, is a longtime friend, and so it's hard for me to assess this in dispassionate policy terms because Siamak and Murad Tabaz and Imad Sharki and the 2 others who have gone unnamed, the Americans who've been held in some cases for as long as 8 years in Iranian prisons, did absolutely nothing wrong. They were being held as a bait, essentially, to try to wrest concessions from the West or to find economic opportunities or for whatever purpose whoever took them initially saw. The regime used them to its own advantage, and I'm just very, very, very glad that they are free today. I worry about the moral hazard that has been clearly established here. The explicit exchange of a large sum of money for the release of these prisoners does differentiate it a bit from some of the past arrangements, whether it's the Algiers Accord that freed the hostages in 1981 or the 2016 deal that released several other Americans. Those were slightly different sets of arrangements. I would also note that those who've negotiated these deals with the Iranians find the Iranians to be incredibly infuriating and not true to their word. In fact, Murad Tabaz had been released previously in 2022 as part of a deal with the British. He was let out on furlough when a woman who had been visiting family was released after years of unjust imprisonment. And Murad was very quickly returned to prison in a direct violation of that agreement. So I think I would say that the Biden administration, I think, was wise to try to ensure that there were no funds released to Iran until and unless those Americans were outside of Iranian airspace and that their family was able to depart with them. I think that sequencing, again, it actually goes back to what happened during the Algiers Accord and the very careful sequencing of the release of funds and the release of individuals. But I think we have a huge moral hazard here. The Iranians have used this tactic again and again and again, and now they know the price. It's $1 billion per individual, and let me tell you, they will continue to take hostages. We have at least about 1,000 Americans who travel to Iran every year, many of them on Iranian passports because they're dual nationals. But frankly, I know of people who've taken travel, sort of tourist trips to Iran, even within the past few months. And
Right.
those people are going to be used in the same fashion that unfortunately these other Americans have been used many times before.
I think according to a 2019 figure, of the 6.5 million visitors to Iran, there were 65,000 Americans. I don't know how reliable that is. That raises the whole question, of course, and Congress is, I think, discussing this, of imposing a travel ban. No Americans should be able to travel to Iran. Now, I'm reporting, I tossed that out. There may be ways for Americans who want to go to Iran to get around that. I don't know. But an American passport holder, because you're right, it's going to happen again. And money is fungible. I don't care how carefully the vetting is done. Oversight with U.S. Treasury, monies that are freed up, Iran's monies notwithstanding, can be used for other purposes. And I think the price is clear. I also think, Suzanne, your comment about Siamak Namazi is right. The opponents of this deal would feel quite differently, particularly the congressional opponents, if their sisters or brothers or husbands or wives or relatives were among those taken. And that's something where the national interest does, in fact, intersect with the personal interest. But I want to ask both of you now. It's a policy question, Robin, and I know you're not a forget policy maker, policy advisor, but you know Iran well. You know the options that are available. You know the many traps that the United States has fallen into with respect to negotiating with Iran. The Biden administration seems to me to have made a very clear-cut decision. In the next 18 months, between now and the presidential election, de-escalation, particularly on one issue, which is Iran enriching uranium at near weapons grade level, is something the administration wants to prevent, because the last thing this administration needs in the next year and a half is a major escalation. Let's presume it begins with Israel and Iran, which could easily, given our policies with respect to the Israelis, draw the United States in. So de-escalation, I won't even mention the word peace, because I think, frankly, that's part of the toxic debate here, which is not reasonable and it's not rational on Iran in this time. Is de-escalation a sensible strategy? Doesn't it depend on what your assessment of risk is? If you believe that Iran and Israel will maintain a kind of low level, neither of them wants an escalation, then in fact, maybe you can just move through the next 18 months without any sort of dealings with Iran, informal, formal. If you believe that escalation is more than likely, then wouldn't you try to do exactly what the administration is trying to do? Suzanne, to you first. What's wrong with this logic chain?
You're asking me first, right, Aaron? Okay. I actually think that it puts us on a very dangerous slide toward an Iranian nuclear weapons capability. And I think that's the one thing that I believe every American president has promised to prevent, including Joe Biden. And I actually believe that President Biden would take the action necessary to do so. Obviously, we have much bigger strategic or other strategic priorities, which are incredibly compelling. Both the urgent challenge of Ukraine and the pacing threat of China. And those consume all the oxygen in the White House right now. And I understand the temptation to say, let's try to shift Iran to the back burner because we don't need this kind of trouble. But the difficulty that we have is that the conditions today are worse than they were 5 years ago, and they're much worse than they were 15 years ago and 20 years ago. And they will not be better in a few more years if we let this problem continue to fester. Whatever we might have been able to get in terms of getting back into a nuclear agreement now is less than it would have been had we not left. And our options continue to shrink and shrink, and our ability to prevent Iran from fully crossing the threshold and racing for a bomb becomes far less to our advantage. So I think the danger that we have is that we can't pick and choose the timing when we deal with problems. And frankly, there is no promise that the challenges of Russia and China are going to become easier post November 24. So
On the contrary.
how do you then deal with in Iran, which is amassed even more highly enriched material and is even closer in terms of the entire nuclear infrastructure of being able to race to a bomb, especially if you haven't begun to create the kind of coalition that we had from 2010 onward until the nuclear deal that we have today when we're dealing with other issues. There is no coalition building when it comes to Iran. And I think that's what I find most frustrating about what the United States has done. We can see the kind of leadership that the administration has shown on both Ukraine and China, pulling together the transatlantic alliance, both before the invasion and since then, in a really robust way. We can see what the administration has done in terms of building minilateral coalitions around the threat of China, whether it's AUKUS or the Quad. There is an enormous amount of diplomatic energy invested in these. There are a lot of big announcements on the Middle East, this new transportation corridor from India to Middle East Europe. I mean, this is words on paper. It is not a meaningful set of arrangements that are going to, in fact, constrain Iran. And frankly, what I find even more worrisome is that we're looking now at a set of arrangements between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which, depending on what the precise contours of that agreement might be, could in fact create not just one but another threshold nuclear state in the region, and that seems quite dangerous.
I would agree with that, for sure. Robin, to you.
Well, you're trying to get me into policy again, and I'm going to resist just as ardently as I did before. But I will say one thing. I think that we're looking at an 18-month period where Iran has elections, and it doesn't want to see an escalation either. The regime wants things to look better. It knows the United States does, and will probably wait in terms of provocations or significant advances until it sees who's, is Biden coming back, or a different Democrat running, or Trump coming back, or a different Republican. They want, that's always, Iran's foreign policy is deeply affected by who's in the White House. But there's also, we forget that Israel is in a bit of political trouble right now too. And if, Air Force pilots don't want to fly, this controversy over the Supreme Court. And so does Israel have the energy or unity to do something over that 18-month period too? So I think we may be in a wait and see mode, but the danger always is, what is Iran doing in the background that don't have IAEA monitors checking out everything as they were under the nuclear deal? Iran has recently expelled some of them. It cut off cameras after an Israeli attack as retaliation, some of the cameras that were positioned in sight. And so we are not as sure about what Iran is doing, and that's very worrisome. And given the increasing involvement of the Revolutionary Guards in every aspect of government and the economy, there is the danger. It's not just the political hardliners, it's also the military, the octopus that has its tentacles and everything in Iran. So, there are no good options right now, frankly. Nothing that's going to decisively make any difference. I do think there is a military coalition that is building CENTCOM has carried out a number of interesting and kind of dynamic exercises with partners in the region. So while we don't have that diplomatic coalition, except with the Europeans, that we do have, I think there are a lot of military plans in place if needed.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. I pointed out at the beginning of our conversation that we have a strategic problem without a strategic solution. I did not mean to suggest, nor will I insult any of your intelligences, that there is a strategic solution. Deterrence, containment, possibility of sanctions, a new JCPOA plus or minus, and of course, the always available military option. It's a mix of instruments that may or may not be effectively, willfully combined to produce an answer to the problem. But, as we conclude, it seems to me, and the two of you are going to forget more about Iran than I'm ever going to know, that unless a new reality is created in Iran, where the acquisitive powers of whoever leads the Iranian people are not bent in the direction of maintaining a nuclear weapons capacity or nuclear weapons, it seems to me we're going to be dealing with this problem for a long time to come. But I will say, and I'm going to have both of you back, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Your authority and skill, your honesty and clarity, I think are really impressive. And it was an honor for me to host both of you. Robin, I will say before we conclude,
Go Blue.
You in particular, born in Ann Arbor, University of Michigan grad. I spent 8 years there, extraordinary. But yes, Robin, go Blue. And I want to thank all of you Carnegie Connects listeners. Some good conversations coming up in October, which will be a prize. Thanks again, Robin, Suzanne. Great conversation. You were wonderful. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks to you, Aaron. Thanks, Robin.
Bye-bye.